She sat in the darkness, pressed against the inside wall of the crate, knees tucked beneath her chin, eyes closed. In front of her face, a rusted nail jutted out from the wooden plank, just below a sign scorched into the wood. Damaged goods. Light slipped through the cracks between the boards. Dawn or dusk, she could no longer tell. The auctioneer's shouts had faded. The crowd had dispersed. Someone bought chickens, someone a lamp, someone a girl no one had even seen. He opened the crate an hour after the square had gone quiet. For a moment, she thought it was those men again, the ones who hit her for staying silent. But the fingers that pulled the boards apart were warm, and they trembled. "Are you here alone?" he asked. She didn't answer. She couldn't. She had forgotten how to speak. He didn't wait for a reply. He simply lifted the crate and carried her to his horse. The sun hovered low over Elm Creek, casting an amber haze across the brittle landscape. Dust hung in the air, unmoved by even the faintest wind, and settled thick over roofs, boots, and broken fences. The town moved slowly, as if weary from the weight of its own silence. In the center of the auction yard, the wooden platform creaked with the memory of bodies and shouting. The crowd had dispersed hours ago. All that remained were broken crates, discarded tags, a single torn glove, and the faint echoes of transactions made without conscience. Off to the side, where the shadow of the auction platform stretched toward the hitching posts, sat a crate. Unlike the others, it hadn't been split or picked over. It stood intact, roughly the size of a feed trunk, nailed shut with iron spikes and stained along the bottom edge where damp earth had reached up to claim it. The boards were weathered, some warped outward as though from pressure within. On its broad side, seared into the wood in heavy, uneven strokes, was a brand. Damaged goods. The letters had bled deep into the grain, blistered and dark, leaving behind the cruel finality of a judgment. No one approached it. Earlier in the day, men had gathered around it briefly, poked at it with their boots, made crass jokes, then wandered off. One suggested it was freight that had gone off ration in the heat. Another swore it was something alive, maybe a half-dead dog or a criminal meant for transfer. But no one opened it. No one bought it. The man who delivered it had done so with little ceremony. A mule cart rolled into town near dawn, and the crate was dropped unceremoniously onto the dirt like a broken promise. He offered no explanation, no paper, just spat near the wheels and left with a half-empty flask and an empty conscience. Time passed. The crate sat untouched as the sun crept across the sky and shadows lengthened. Occasionally, a curious child drifted too close and was pulled back by a mother's stern hand. A few of the older boys from town threw stones at it, laughing when one thunked off the corner with a hollow thud. Inside, nothing stirred. Or so it seemed. Those with sharper instincts, quiet men, broken women, might have paused near it long enough to notice a subtle shift in the silence. Not a cry, not even a gasp, just the barest rhythm, like the whisper of breathing pressed deep behind wood and shame. What lay inside did not want to be seen. The dark space between the boards held more than just a body. It held hours of stillness, fear grown heavy in the lungs, and skin too tired to sweat anymore. A pair of knees hugged to a narrow chest, arms curled tight, chin buried down. The girl inside had stopped counting days. The light that peeked in through the seams was no longer a sign of time, but simply a reminder that the world outside still moved while hers stood still. The heat had long become part of her. Her back was slick against the interior, the skin rubbed raw where it touched splinters. Her mouth was dry, tongue thick like fabric, but her stomach no longer complained. Hunger had faded. What replaced it was hollow and flat, a space where sound used to be. She had not spoken in days, maybe weeks, She didn't remember the last word she'd said or who she'd said it to. In the beginning, she had whispered for help. Later, she begged. Then she just breathed. At some point during the afternoon, the wind changed. Not much, just enough to lift a few strands of her hair where it hung like straw over her cheek. She shifted slightly, just enough to feel the sharp jab of a nail against her calf. She didn't flinch. Pain had become a friend. At least it proved she was still there. Still real. Still not entirely gone. Outside, footsteps passed now and then. Boots scraping dirt. Wheels creaking. A horse snorting. But none stopped. The town had made its judgment. She was waste, leftover, misdelivered, and misfit. The branding on the crate had not been there when she was first placed inside. It had been added later, when someone decided her silence meant brokenness, when someone gave up, when someone wanted the world to know she wasn't worth fixing. As the light grew dimmer, a long shadow stretched across the box. A moment passed, then another, and then the faint sound of something shifting. A hand, perhaps, brushing against the scorched lettering. The crate did not react. The girl inside barely breathed. But somewhere deep behind her closed eyelids, something flickered. Not hope, not yet. Just a pause. A disruption in the silence. A breath held. And not released. The sky had shifted to a deeper shade of gold when he rode into town. Dust swirled beneath the hooves of his horse, curling around its legs like smoke as it carried its rider slowly down the main street of Elm Creek. He moved without hurry, the way men do who have seen too much and expect little from the places they pass through. His coat, long and faded, flapped gently with the rhythm of the ride, and his hat, dark and slouched forward, shadowed a face weathered by time and silence. He looked like a man who had once spoken often but now found more comfort in stillness. He tethered the horse outside the saloon and stepped down without a word. No one noticed him. No one ever did. That suited him. The wind tugged at the tail of his coat as he crossed the square, eyes scanning the yard with the kind of focus that didn't seem urgent but missed nothing. He walked past broken barrels, coils of rusted rope, a cracked watering trough that hadn't held water in years. The last of the townsfolk were drifting home, their backs bent under the weight of heat and habit. He could have passed through like a shadow, unnoticed and forgotten, if not for the shape at the edge of the auction block. He stopped. His boots sank slightly into the soft earth as he turned toward the crate. It sat low, half in shadow, half bathed in the last gold of the day. From a distance, it looked like nothing. A box abandoned like so many others, just another pile of refuse in a place that didn't have time to care. But something about the way it leaned, the sharpness of the burned letters, the deliberate violence in the branding, it tugged at something in him he hadn't felt in years. Not anger, not even pity. Just that old, buried sensation of something being not right. He walked closer. The lettering became clearer with each step, the wood more brutal in its splinters, its bruises. The iron nails were uneven, some bent, driven in without care. He studied it not like a man observing an object, but like a tracker studying sign in the dirt. Something about the crate spoke of speed, haste, not just to deliver, but to forget. He crouched beside it. The dust rose gently around his knees. He didn't move right away, didn't touch the box, just watched, listened. And after a moment, he heard it. The softest breath, the kind that wouldn't register unless you were listening for it. It wasn't a sound meant to be heard. It was a sound meant to stay hidden. The kind made by someone trying not to exist. He let the silence sit between them. It was better that way. The world had spoken loudly enough already. There was nothing he could say that the child inside hadn't heard twisted 1,000 times over. Promises were wind. Words meant knives. Even stillness had become sharp with time. So he didn't speak. He just waited. The sun slipped lower, its light crawling across the dirt until it kissed the edge of the crate. The warmth of it bled through the cracks, inching along the grain, sliding across the label like an afterthought. Damaged goods glowed a dull red for a moment, like a wound reopened by firelight. And then the crate shifted. Not much, just a breath inside, maybe a shoulder brushing against the wall. But it was enough. Enough to confirm what he already knew. Enough to make his jaw tighten beneath his beard. He reached into his coat, slowly, calmly, pulled out a worn knife, the handle dark with age, the blade short but clean. He turned it in his fingers once, then slipped it into the edge of the crate where two planks met. The wood resisted at first, as if resentful for being disturbed. But with steady pressure, the blade worked loose the first nail, then the second. The sound of it, metal dragging out of wood, was louder than anything else in that moment. The third nail let go with a sigh. He pried back the plank. Inside, it was darker than he expected. The space smelled of damp and old fear. Straw lined the bottom, flattened and dirty, and in the middle, tucked tight as if trying to make herself vanish into the corners, was a girl. Her limbs were too thin, her skin pale beneath streaks of dirt. Her eyes were open, wide, locked on his hand and the knife, not moving, not blinking. He could tell she'd been in there a long time. Her hair, tangled and matted, framed a face that had not been touched by kindness in months, maybe longer. Her mouth didn't move. Her chest barely rose, but she was breathing and watching. Every nerve in her body strung tight, waiting to determine whether this was the next hurt or the first mercy. He pulled the plank aside further and set it down in the dirt. He did not reach for her. He did not make a sound. He simply stepped back, just far enough to let the air pass between them, the space she needed, the space she deserved. She didn't move, not yet, but her eyes followed him. The wind stirred again, lifting strands of her hair, pushing the scent of dust and sweat and wood between them. She blinked once, slow. Her hands shifted slightly, fingers brushing her own forearms like she was reminding herself she was still there. He watched, still crouched, arms resting loosely on his knees. And then she did something he wasn't sure he was ready for. She exhaled. Not fear, not surrender. Recognition. As if, for the first time in a long, unmeasured stretch of days, she had seen something that did not ask, did not demand, did not hurt. And that was enough, for now. He stood, stepped away, and walked toward his horse without a word. Behind him, the crate sat open, empty of secrets now, but full of silence, the kind that waits, the kind that watches the man who didn't turn away. The trail home stretched long beneath a sky that had turned from gold to rust. The last of the light folded itself into the hills, leaving only slanted shadows and the hush of evening that blanketed the prairie like a worn quilt. He rode slow, not because of fatigue or burden, but because the quiet felt sacred. Behind him, the girl sat in the rear of the wagon, bundled in an old blanket he had kept folded under the saddle since winter. She didn't speak. She hadn't since he opened the crate, and he hadn't expected her to. The silence between them wasn't awkward. It was survival. It was a language neither of them needed to translate. The wagon creaked gently as the wheels cut into the dry earth. With each jostle, she adjusted her grip on the edge of the bench, not out of discomfort, but because she needed the contact, something to remind her she was still in motion, still not back in that dark box. She kept her eyes low, face turned toward the side rails, not daring to look past them. The open land might have been beautiful, endless, breathtaking to another child. But to her it was foreign, unsafe, unknowable. She wasn't ready to let it in. He glanced back only once, just long enough to make sure she hadn't vanished. She hadn't. She was still there, small and quiet, framed by the wooden ribs of the wagon, her silhouette half lit by the afterglow of the setting sun. When they crested a ridge, the land below opened into a shallow valley, broken only by a lone house leaning into the wind, its boards faded and tired, its windows dark and square like watching eyes. Behind it, a crooked barn slumped against a cluster of fence posts, and beside that, a well and a rusted windmill that barely turned anymore. The place wasn't much, but it was his, and tonight, it would be hers too. He led the horse into the paddock, unhitching the wagon with practiced hands. The girl didn't move until the creaking stopped. Only then did she lift her head. The sky above the house had dimmed to a cool slate gray, and the first star blinked into existence just over the barn's sagging roof. She climbed down slowly, her bare feet hesitant on the dusty ground. She didn't look at the house. She didn't look at him. She simply stood, holding the blanket tight around her shoulders, and waited. He left the door open as he went inside. The house was simple, just 2 rooms, a stove, a table, a single chair worn smooth at the arms. There was bread on the counter, cold stew in a pot. The girl stepped inside without prompting, her presence light as shadow. She moved like someone who had learned how not to disturb the air. He gestured toward the food and then stepped away, giving her the distance she didn't have the words to ask for. She sat at the edge of the bench, not quite touching the table, and ate in tiny bites, like every movement needed permission. That night, he didn't lock the door. She slept curled on the floor near the hearth, the blanket wrapped around her body like armor. Her breathing stayed shallow, even in sleep, as if her body didn't yet trust that it was safe enough to rest. He watched her for a moment from the doorway of the adjoining room, the dim firelight flickering across her face. Then he turned away and left her to the peace she had found, no matter how fragile. The next morning came slowly. The first hours passed without words. She remained still while he moved through the rhythm of chores, feeding the chickens, hauling water, checking the fence line. When he returned, she was sitting by the window, arms wrapped around her knees, eyes watching the field. She didn't notice him. Or perhaps she did and chose not to react. Either way, he didn't interrupt. The days that followed unfolded in much the same way. She didn't ask for anything. She didn't cry. She didn't run. She simply existed, occupying corners, shadows, and silence. She followed him sometimes, at a distance, never close enough to be considered company, but always near enough to observe. She watched how he filled the troughs, how he fixed the gate, how he moved without speaking. She began to mimic his steps, his posture, the way he knelt near the soil to check for broken glass. At night, she would lie in the same spot on the floor, the blanket clutched tight, her eyes never fully closed. The fire dimmed, the wind sighed against the shutters, and still she lay quiet, her thoughts locked somewhere he couldn't reach. On the 6th evening, something shifted. She stood at the threshold of the barn, her fingers grazing the splintered doorframe. He was inside, stacking feed sacks, the light from the lantern casting long lines across the wooden floor. She didn't speak, but her presence filled the space. He glanced at her, then back to the sacks. She didn't move, didn't retreat. She just stood, bare feet against cool earth, as if daring herself to believe that this place would not reject her. Later that night, he set a basin of warm water on the porch, a bar of soap, a towel. He left them without comment. In the darkness, long after the house had gone still, she stepped outside. The stars were sharp above her, thousands of tiny fires in the great black above. She stood under their gaze, trembling, not from cold, but from the fear of being seen, even by the sky. She washed slowly, methodically, as though trying to erase something deeper than dirt. Her fingers trembled as they ran over bruises, over lines where rope had once pressed too tight. She didn't scrub hard. She didn't punish. She simply cleaned. The next morning, she wore the clean shirt he had left folded on the bench. It hung off her shoulders like it didn't belong to her body. But she wore it. She sat at the table that day, not just near it. She ate without shrinking. She still didn't speak. But when he passed by the window on his way out to the barn, he saw her eyes follow him. Not in fear. In something else. Something just beginning to thaw. The days passed with the soft quiet of a life mending itself in slow, invisible layers. The ranch moved through its rhythms. The groan of the well's rope in the morning, the clatter of hooves against the paddock at noon, the dry rustle of wind weaving through tall grass at dusk. Within that rhythm, she learned how to move again. Not in fear, not in retreat, but in cautious participation. She fed the chickens, sometimes one at a time, her hands shaking slightly as they pecked near her boots. She watched the stove until the flame caught, stood beside him when he chopped wood, swept the porch with more care than need. Her silence remained, but it no longer felt hollow. It had shape now. Weight. A presence that filled the room even when she wasn't seen. He didn't press her. There were no questions about her past, no invitations to speak before she was ready. He let her exist beside him without the demand for explanation. And because of that, something within her began to uncurl. She stood straighter. Her gaze lifted more often. She didn't flinch at the sound of footsteps. The blanket, once a constant barrier wrapped tight around her frame, now lay folded neatly at the foot of her bedroll, untouched for days. But healing never comes without shadow. One morning, just as the sun broke over the ridgeline, a figure appeared down the road. He came on horseback, his silhouette sharp against the pale light, moving with the easy confidence of someone used to being obeyed. Dust trailed behind him like a slow-burning fuse. The dog barked once, low and uncertain, and fell quiet. From the porch, the man watched the rider draw closer, a prickle crawling along his spine, old instincts rising. The rider didn't dismount. He reined in by the gate, his eyes hidden beneath the brim of his hat, his mouth set in a line carved deep by arrogance and the certainty of ownership. He wore a silver badge, though it glinted with more self-importance than authority. Slung across his saddle was a satchel bulging with papers, buckles, and folded cloth. His voice was too loud for the quiet morning, his tone too practiced. He had come not to ask, but to reclaim. She had been sweeping the floor when the hoofbeats reached her ears. By the time the man on the horse spoke, she had already moved to the window, the broom forgotten. Her hands gripped the sill, her knuckles white with the pressure of memory. She didn't look out, not at first. She stared down at the floor, lips pressed thin, breath locked somewhere in her ribs. But the voice outside, its cadence, its smug certainty, it crawled through the cracks in the wood, through the loose threads of her new life, and wrapped itself tight around her throat. When she finally looked, it was slow. Her gaze rose as if against weight, against history. The man outside hadn't changed. His boots were the same, the belt, the posture. He still looked at her like something he had once bought, used, and discarded. A possession that had somehow wandered off and now needed collecting. Her stomach churned, not from fear, but from the sudden return of what she thought she'd buried. He handed over a slip of paper. The man took it without flinching, read it, folded it, and said nothing. The writer said more, something about orders, about rightful custody, about stolen property. But the words passed like smoke. Empty. Rehearsed. By the time the writer turned and galloped back toward town, the air had gone cold despite the sun. That night, she didn't sleep by the hearth. She sat on the porch until long after the stars appeared, her knees drawn to her chest, her eyes staring into the darkness beyond the fence. He didn't ask what she remembered. He didn't offer comfort. He simply stayed near, splitting kindling with measured precision, letting the crack of wood fill the spaces where words might have gone. The days after were quieter, if such a thing were possible. She moved like someone being watched, even when she was alone. She flinched at shadows, hesitated at open doors, retreated from the edge of light. Her hands shook when she tried to carry water, her grip unsteady as if the weight of the pail had become unpredictable. He noticed, but he didn't interfere. He adjusted his steps, his habits, left things where she could reach without asking. He fixed the latch on her door. He replaced the worn-out boards on the barn, one nail at a time. One morning, she didn't come out. The fire in the hearth had gone cold, her bedroll still neatly made, untouched. He knocked gently, once, and waited. When she didn't respond, he stepped back, sat on the porch, and remained there until the sun was high. She appeared eventually, her face pale, lips dry, eyes rimmed with red. She didn't carry the silence anymore. It carried her. She spent more time in the barn after that, sitting in the loft, legs dangling over the edge, staring at the distant line where the field met the sky. Sometimes she would trace shapes in the dust, small patterns with no meaning, just movement to keep her grounded. Sometimes she would pull at the frayed hem of her sleeve until the thread split. The man let her be. He came and went, each day beginning and ending with the simple fact that she was still there, still choosing to remain, even if the cost was high. The crate had been left behind, burned with the rest of the auction's remnants weeks ago. But in her mind, it lingered. She carried it within her still. The dark corners, the dry air, the label burned into her skin not by flame, but by memory. Damaged goods. A phrase meant to define, to limit, to erase. But each morning she rose was a rebellion. Each meal eaten, each small task completed, each moment spent outside the lines of fear. They were all quiet declarations that she was still here, still whole, still fighting. And yet, the weight never lifted completely. The warning from the man on horseback was a storm on the horizon. Distant, but certain. He would return. Men like that always did. The law in his mouth wasn't about justice. It was about ownership and control and punishment for disobedience. She began to prepare, not with weapons or plans, but with resolve. She began to breathe more deeply, to walk with her shoulders straighter, to meet his eyes when he spoke to her. Her silence changed shape. It became rooted, intentional. No longer fear, not quite defiance, something in between. Something unbroken. The day began with a stillness that felt deliberate, like the earth itself was holding its breath. The air was dense, the sky smeared with a chalky haze that dulled the edges of the hills and made the sunlight feel heavy rather than warm. Birds didn't sing. The wind barely moved the grasses. It was the kind of morning that made people nervous without knowing why. that left animals pacing near fences and dogs refusing to rest. He noticed it when he stepped outside, how even the wood of the porch creaked differently beneath his boots, as though protesting some unseen tension. Inside the house, she stood at the sink with her back to the door, shoulders drawn in tight beneath the collar of her borrowed shirt. Her hair had grown out slightly, softening the hard lines that once framed her face. But her movements were slow that morning, deliberate, almost mechanical. She had sensed it too. Something was shifting. The air had changed, the world leaning slightly off its usual balance. By mid-morning, a dust trail rose on the road again. Thin at first, then growing in density as the horse approached. She didn't need to look. She knew it was him. The same man. The same horse. The same eyes that had once looked at her as though she were no more than inventory gone missing. Her hands clenched involuntarily around the tin cup she was drying, and she set it down carefully, placing it far from the edge of the counter. Then she stepped away from the window and sat down on the bench near the fire, her back straight, legs together, palms flat against her knees. Waiting. The man on the porch didn't speak this time. He didn't have to. His presence carried weight, a force sharpened by paperwork and signatures, by threats written in ink and filed in offices far from the dust and wood of this place. He held the same satchel, but this time it bulged less with papers and more with confidence. He believed he was right, that the law was behind him, that she would be returned and the matter closed like the ledgers he probably carried with him. The man of the house read the document he was handed in silence. It was official. It was stamped. It named her property of a system that still refused to call her a person. A minor, a dependent, a ward, anything but a name. She didn't cry. She didn't plead. She sat on the bench and stared into the cold ashes of the fire, her breath steady, her eyes unreadable. When they came for her the first time, she had screamed. When they locked the crate, she had pounded until her fists split open. But now she did nothing. Not because she had given up, because she knew the fire had to burn a second time. He didn't try to explain. He had no words to soften what the page declared, no clause to argue, no loophole to exploit. He stood with the paper in one hand and a decision in the other, and he made it without sound. He nodded once. The man in the badge smiled, turned, and walked toward his horse. But what he hadn't noticed, what neither man noticed, was that she was no longer sitting. She had moved quietly, slipping through the kitchen door and out into the dust-colored barn. Inside, the air smelled of hay and rust and old oil. She climbed the ladder to the loft and crouched near the window, her arms wrapped around her legs, her head low. From there, she could see everything. The porch, the horse, the shape of the man folding the paper into his coat. She stayed there as footsteps echoed in the yard, and the sound of saddlebags being adjusted filled the quiet. The horse shifted its weight. Leather creaked, metal tapped against stirrup. Then the voice came, calling her name as if it belonged to him. And then came the fire. No one saw it start. No one heard the strike of a match or the snap of dry kindling. But within moments, the corner of the barn lit with an orange glow, slow and hungry. Smoke threaded its way up the rafters, curling past the window where she had been just seconds before. The horse bucked in alarm, the man on the porch turning sharply at the scent of burning. He ran first, shouting, calling her name into the smoke. She wasn't inside. She had never been inside. By the time the flames reached the roof, she was halfway down the gully behind the field, barefoot and moving through tall weeds, her frame low to the ground, body tight with purpose. She didn't run like someone fleeing. She ran like someone remembering the path she had imagined every night in silence. He found her hours later, huddled beneath the wooden skeleton of a collapsed bridge 2 miles from the edge of the property. Her feet were scraped, her hair damp with sweat, her lips cracked from holding her breath. But she was alive. Her eyes, wide and trembling, met his not with apology, but with a fierce clarity that struck him motionless. He knelt beside her, resting his hands on his thighs, and waited. She didn't speak. He didn't ask. Instead, they sat together in the stillness, the space between them filled with more truth than any law had ever written. The barn burned to the ground that night. Neighbors saw the smoke and came, but there was little left to save. The man with the badge never returned. He had lost her twice now, and something in his posture when he last looked back had said he understood that further pursuit would cost more than she was worth on paper. The sky turned dark above the hollowed-out structure. Embers floated upward like tiny stars forgetting their place. He stood in the ruins long after the others had gone, the smell of ash thick in his lungs. In the dirt where the barn once stood, he saw a small object glinting. He bent to retrieve it, a bent nail twisted with heat, its point blackened. He turned it over once in his palm, then let it fall. Back at the house, she sat near the fire, her face glowing with its warmth, eyes half lowered but no longer empty. She didn't flinch when the door opened, didn't tense when he stepped inside. She simply looked at him, then to the place where the crate had once stood, then back to him again. There was no need for words. They had already been set in fire. The seasons began to shift, slowly, with the quiet certainty of a world indifferent to human timelines. The mornings turned cooler, the fields faded from green to gold, and the wind carried with it the scent of dry leaves and distant frost. On the ranch, the changes came in smaller, gentler ways. The sun rose later behind the hills, and the shadows stretched farther across the porch. The chickens grew restless in the early dusk, and the dogs slept curled tighter near the fire. Everything whispered of autumn, of endings and quiet beginnings, of time folding inward to protect something tender. He watched her change without announcing it. He measured her healing not in words, but in gestures. The way she would sit on the porch steps in the late afternoon, feet bare and dusty, a half-smile flickering at the corners of her mouth as the dog lay beside her. The way she would hum, low and tuneless, while sweeping the kitchen, unaware she was doing it. The way she once reached across the table to hand him a folded napkin, her fingers brushing his hand without flinching. He built her a room of her own, adding it to the side of the house with his own hands, plank by plank, nail by nail. She helped, holding the wood steady, brushing away sawdust, occasionally offering a glance that said more than thanks ever could. It wasn't large, just enough for a bed, a chest, and a window that opened to the east. The first morning she woke there, the sky was pale pink, the world still wrapped in silence. She sat on the edge of the bed, feet dangling just above the floor, and watched the light move across the walls. It was the first space in her life that belonged only to her. Later that month, they went to the county clerk's office. The room was dusty, paper-heavy, smelling of ink and leather. The man behind the counter asked questions, most of which she answered herself. She gave her first name slowly, carefully, as though speaking it into the world for the first time. Then, without hesitation, she gave a last name. His. The man at the desk glanced up, pen paused, and she met his eyes without blinking. That night, they sat together on the porch, a lantern burning low beside them. The sky above was scattered with stars, cold and white, stretching from one horizon to the next. She rested her head against the post, one knee drawn to her chest, arms folded loosely around it. He leaned back in the chair, eyes half closed, listening to the wind. From somewhere deep in the pasture, a horse whinnied softly. The wind shifted. The lantern flickered. She turned her head toward him, not to ask, not to tell, just to look. He met her gaze and held it, and in that quiet, unbroken moment, everything settled. She was home,